it's too soon to say what the longer term consequences will be. But certainly it is a new chapter because Qatar was regarded as a safe place. It was a safe place because America had asked Doha to host the Hamas leadership. And I know that because I in Damascus some time ago speaking with President Assad, and he told me that at the beginning of the Iraq war, Colin Powell had come and warned him that if they didn't cut the links to Iran and to Hamas very quickly, then there would be Syria would be sent back to the Stone Age virtually. And Assad said, so I said, well, what do you want me to do with Hamas? You want me to send them to their deaths in Gaza? Is that what you're asking for? Oh, no, 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 said Colin Powell. No, they're going to Doha. It's all arranged.
This moment really illustrates how deliberate U.S. policy decisions have shaped today's crisis. When Washington asked Doha to host Hamas leadership, it wasn't just about relocation, it was a strategic move to keep them contained and reachable. What we're seeing now is the unraveling of that entire architecture. Safe havens like Doha were meant to stabilize the region, not turn into new flashpoints. The fact that this arrangement is being tested now shows how quickly the guardrails of U.S. foreign policy are coming off. And when those guardrails go, history tells us, whether in Lebanon, Iraq, or Afghanistan, we usually see more chaos before we see stability.
So, it was even back then, an accepted that Qatar would act in a special circumstances, mediator, a safe place for the leadership to exist, and also the financial relationships, first of all with Gaza, but also then with Netanyahu and with others in Israel. All of this was down to Qatar. And it's been playing a very complicated game. On the one hand, it has been hosting and acting as mediators. For you recall, even with the Taliban a little time ago, the Taliban were in Doha because the Americans wanted to talk to the Taliban. So this has been going on for some time and clearly under the auspices of the United States. And then suddenly, what happens with this failed attack on the Hamas negotiating team?
This is one of those moves that has second and third order effects we'll be talking about for years. When you eliminate negotiators during talks, you don't just kill individuals, you kill the process. It sends a message that diplomacy isn't safe, and that makes future ceasefire efforts nearly impossible.
Hamas negotiating team had been set up, of course, because what were they doing all being together? They were there to discuss the Witkoff plan. What was happening in Iran a little time ago? Well, of course, the Iranians were preparing for discussions on the Witkoff plan for the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement in Oman. And so they were taken by surprise by the coordinated attack on Iran. So all of these things have a history of if you do, setting up peace talks. The same happened incidentally with Hezbollah. The Hezbollah were meeting to discuss another American proposal. So you have three of these cases where uh, the US proposals were used as bait to get a leadership together into one place, and then they were killed. The aim was to do the same in Iran to catch Iran balance, and then now we have Doha.
This is a recurring theme. peace talks being weaponized. It's a very risky precedent because once leaders believe negotiations are simply bait for assassination or ambush, they'll refuse to sit at the table altogether. That pushes us further into a world where only force decides outcomes.
There are long-term consequences to destroying your mediators. I mean, this happened to me once in Gaza, and I'd negotiated a ceasefire with Hamas and also with the forces of Fatah. And it was all set up and it was due to start on the next, in a day or so. And I was just waiting for the okay from Damascus. And then it was consisted there was going to be an article prepared to explain it for the New York Times. And there was also all the complicated arrangements for between the Tanzim and the and Hamas about how to manage the details of a ceasefire and what to do if the Israelis invaded or bombed or something like that. And then I was went to bed and being told by Brussels that I had to inform the Israelis about that the ceasefire was about to start. And then I was woken up at 4 in the morning by Javier Solana, who was the High Representative of the European Union. And he said, "Have you seen the news?" And I said, "No, I haven't. What is it?" And he said, "They've dropped a 1-ton bomb on the house of Shahada, who was the negotiator for Hamas, killing him and 13 others. His entire family were killed." And that was the end of course, the ceasefire. And I remember sort of some people sort of from the Israeli side sort of laughing at me and saying, how does it feel having all this blood on your hands?
Ah,
You were so naive to try and get a ceasefire.
That's chilling and telling. It shows how some players view negotiations not as opportunities for peace, but as traps to exploit. This reminds me of other historical moments where mediators were undermined. Think of Bosnia in the 1990s, or even the early Vietnam talks. When diplomacy is mocked, conflict becomes the default language.
hmm. How do you view Trump in making foreign policy decisions? In 2 months, he has taken two very close allies, India and Qatar, and turned them into profound, bitter enemies. One, Qatar, probably symbolic, one, India, of profound economic significance.
Well, I have heard, there are theories that this is deliberate. This is an attempt to change the region, but I don't accept this. I think that it is goes back to the team's really poor understanding of the region and foreign policy. In terms of India, I think it was thought that India was sort of halfway already to being an ally of the United States, and just one little push would separate India from Russia and China and from the BRICS, and that they would then come over to America in terms of dividing the BRICS and weakening, if you like, the relationship. But they didn't seem to understand. I mean, the two key things which were important was that India was also in the midst of doing a complicated free trade negotiation with the European Union. And for India, this was much more important in many ways because the amount of trade that India did with the United States is small, about 3% or something. And also the sort of trade that can be, if you like, diverted to other markets, can be pushed into other markets. Whereas the trade with, particularly with the European Union on agricultural and other products, is vital to India. And so it was an extremely silly idea, which apparently, I mean, I hear, but I can't confirm it exactly, but the thinking behind it apparently, Friedman, who has been very much involved in these thinking, George Friedman, was saying that the idea behind this was that, well, look, China, it's too difficult. I mean, you know, we can't go to war with the country that owns our supply lines. I
Right.
mean, we're dependent on China and China is dependent on us. The latter part is not true. China is not dependent. It's not nearly so dependent on the United States as the US is on China. And they said, we're thinking we'll take India off the table.
This is a textbook example of Washington misreading the room. India isn't a pawn to be taken off the table. It's a rising power with its own strategic calculus. Trying to strong-arm New Delhi into choosing sides has historically backfired, just like it did during the Cold War.
And that will make it easier for China to come to terms with the US. And in fact, that didn't happen because on Saturday, with Besant meeting with the Chinese foreign minister, the Chinese announced that they were instigating a trade investigation into the practices of America in terms of chip and related items, and whether it was contrary to the Trade Act. So, I mean, they're playing hardball still, and it's obvious why. It's called Siberia 2, because when China and Russia signed the agreement for Siberia 2, China did something which was hugely strategic. It made itself dependent on Russia as much as Russia becomes dependent on China. And this is a long historic way of China. I mean, from 2000 years back, China's foreign policy has always been based on how do you keep the kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, secure from the enemies on its borders. And even, 1,000, 2,000 years ago, the idea was you have trade corridors, you have links to all of your far reaching sort of elements of the kingdom. And they instituted even then the practice of making the axle length was to be standard. So they could go on standard routes anywhere in the Middle Kingdom at any time. And this was their way of sort of Gulliverizing together the whole of the Middle Kingdom to protect themselves from trouble. And so this is what they've just done with Russia. They've extended this the gas pipeline, or going to it won't be until 2030 that it'll be complete. But the Chinese are very quick in building these things, and then that is part of the connection, together with all the other trade agreements that they made, both with Russia and India. You can see that this is China going back to its roots about foreign policy.
Exactly. China's playbook here is ancient and deliberate. They're weaving together a secure economic and energy network that ensures resilience, not just for the next decade, but for generations. This is why Beijing thinks in centuries while Washington still thinks in election cycles.
The European Union, when it comes to putting tariffs or sanctions on India and China, requires all member states, it requires full consensus of member states to take that forward. And that's never going to come. I mean, Hungary and Slovakia, for a start, will not agree to it, but many other states will refuse. And also because a European Union is frightened of Chinese reactions and counter-sanctions against Europe. In the case of Europe with China, Europe is very vulnerable, and China is in the commanding position, particularly on vehicles and cars, and it's instituting also inquiries and legal action to impose sanctions on the EU over certain elements of electronic vehicles. So the EU, I mean, is of course not the case. But what is going on then? Well, I think the more disturbing thing is what we hear, and it was already present at the SCO meeting in China a little while ago, is that America has done nothing at all to prepare for a permanent agreement between Russia, uh, uh, between Russia and Ukraine. There is no preparations. There are no, even the technical meetings don't happen. And there's no sign that Ukraine has any interest in coming to those technical meetings. There's no preparation for a trilateral meeting.
This is striking. No groundwork for peace even as the conflict escalates. In past wars, back channels were always alive even during the darkest fighting. The absence of those channels now tells us something important. Key players don't just lack a plan for peace, they may not even want one.
What good came from what good, if anything, came from the Alaska meeting between President Trump and President Putin?
Two things, really. The first was that, and this was intentional. They wanted to get to make sure that Trump understood what Putin's proposal is, that he was going to, if you like, impose a solution through force on Europe and Zelensky in Ukraine. And the view in Moscow is that was successful. He seemed to get it. And indeed, that's what came out of the meeting. The other thing, which was much more doubtful, they thought that Trump had agreed, and this was what they told their colleagues at Xinjiang meeting of the SCO. They told Putin told them he thought he had an understanding with Trump to delay sanctions and to give him Putin the space to take forward the military operation. As Putin has said, we are going to complete and finish the objectives of the military operation. Really, come what may, whatever you want, but that's what we're going to do. But that didn't last long, because then we had the Europeans saying, well, we want more sanctions, we want bigger sanctions. And now we've had, of course, a great scare, which was obviously part of this exercise with the drones. These drones which contained no explosive or no warhead, that were supposedly fired from Russia into Poland, is quite clearly, in my view, a setup, quite clearly an attempt to, if you like, lay the foundations for a bigger NATO exercise against Russia. They've had Article 4 meetings in NATO, and the Europeans have just decided, or European members of NATO have decided, that they're going to have preposition forces in certain 7 or 8.
This is where things get very dangerous. Prepositioning forces is not a defensive measure. It's preparation for escalation. History is clear. Once boots and weapons are staged close to the front, the temptation to use them rises dramatically.
It's the architecture for, this ambition for having, a wider conflict with Russia when they can get European forces into Ukraine.
Before we go, Alastair, 110,000 people in London demonstrating against the government. Is that a big deal?
Yeah, because it wasn't 110,000. That's what the police said it was. But everyone else who's looked at the videos and who has some experience in this saw one of the biggest demonstrations ever held in Britain, probably several 100,000, not just 110. The police always give underestimations of these figures, and I think it discredits them. I don't think it helps them. Yes, it has shocked Europe and it has shocked Britain. The size of the antagonism to the government and to the establishment. I mean, and it was huge. Lots of people went. Um, ordinary people who came and protested and waved the flags. I mean, it may sound amazing to you in the United States because you are often waving flags, the American flag, freely and cheerily. Well, in Britain, it is regarded as something that the government will not allow. They keep taking down the Union flag or the cross, St. George's Cross flag, and removing it and say that this is a sign of far right activism and won't be allowed. Well, they were waving the flags and they were saying, we want our country back. And of course, it was affected by what happened to Charlie Kirk. That's had its impact in Britain and in other parts of Europe as well, not just in its narrower perspectives, but perhaps in its wider perspectives too.
That last point is so important. The public is waking up. These massive demonstrations in Britain aren't just about one policy or one war, they're about trust. People are saying they no longer believe the narratives coming from their governments. And when that trust collapses, it forces leaders to either change course or double down. History shows us, whether it was Vietnam, Iraq, or the Arab Spring, public pressure can shift the trajectory of entire conflicts. The question is whether Western governments will listen this time or repeat the mistakes that brought us here.